The bracelet gleamed faintly under the dim light as I stood in front of the mirror, my fingers running over the smooth silver band. It was a simple piece of jewelry, yet it felt impossibly heavy. Heavy with thoughts I couldn't yet articulate. Heavy with a memory that lingered on the edge of clarity. My reflection stared back, the faint lines around my eyes seeming more pronounced, as if accusing me of something I hadn't yet done. This is how it begins, I thought, though I couldn't yet tell if it was the beginning of ruin or release. Earlier that day, the house had been unusually quiet. Jake, my husband of 10 years, was busy on a call in his study, his voice a steady hum of authority. That was how he lived. Structured, measured, and dependable. Qualities I admired, but hadn't felt inspired by in years. I'd found myself longing for something more. Not security, but spontaneity. I was setting a tray of freshly brewed coffee on the kitchen counter when the door opened. Jake's voice carried down the hall, cheerful and welcoming. "Come in, Alex," he said, and the clatter of shoes against the hardwood followed. When I turned the corner, there he was. Alex, Jake's nephew. His presence was magnetic in a way I didn't expect. Tall, with tousled dark hair and sharp features softened by a warm, easy smile. His eyes were a light hazel, quick and curious, the kind of eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on. "Emma," Jake said, gesturing toward him. "This is Alex. He'll be staying with us for a few weeks. He's working on a script and needed a quiet place to focus." Alex extended his hand, and I took it. His grip was firm, his touch just warm enough to register. "It's nice to finally meet you," he said, his voice smooth but casual. "And you?" I replied, pulling my hand back a second too quickly. The heat lingered longer than it should have. By evening, Alex had settled in. His laptop was open on the coffee table, and a notebook filled with dense handwriting lay beside it. Jake was engrossed in an architectural draft on his computer, leaving Alex and me in the living room. "You're working late," I remarked, setting down a glass of water for him. "Creativity doesn't keep regular hours," he said with a chuckle, leaning back on the couch. "Though I think I've rewritten this scene 100 times already. What's it about?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to mine before he spoke. "It's about people who think they've figured life out, only to realize they've been missing something essential. They find it in the most unexpected places." There was a weight to his words that hung in the air between us. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, as if he were speaking to me directly. "Sounds intriguing," I said, my voice softer than intended. "What about you?" he asked, his tone shifting, lightening. "What keeps you busy when you're not keeping Jake in line?" The question caught me off guard. No one had asked me that in a long time. Not Jake, not anyone. "I manage a home decor shop," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's nothing glamorous, but it's mine." "That's not nothing," he said, his eyes holding mine for a beat too long. "Having something of your own is rare these days." Later that night, as I lay in bed next to Jake, his breathing steady and deep, I stared at the ceiling. Alex's words replayed in my mind, mingling with his image. There was a spark in him, a vitality that seemed to shine through, even in the simplest conversations. I closed my eyes, trying to will away the thought. It was just the excitement of meeting someone new, I told myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. "This is how it begins," I thought again, the weight of the bracelet on my wrist a quiet reminder. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that wrapped around you like a heavy blanket. It was late, and most nights by this time, I'd be in bed, scrolling through my phone or reading a book. But tonight, I found myself holding a cup of tea in trembling hands, standing outside Alex's door. I knocked softly, barely more than a tap. His voice came from the other side, low and inviting. "Come in." I stepped inside, the faint glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He was perched on the edge of the bed, his posture relaxed but focused. His room smelled faintly of cedarwood and coffee, a combination that somehow suited him perfectly. He looked up, his hazel eyes catching the light, and smiled. "You're still up?" he asked, closing his laptop slightly. "I thought you might want some tea," I replied, my voice almost too quiet. My hands betrayed me, trembling just enough for the cup to clink softly against the saucer as I set it down on the small desk by the window. "Thank you." He stood and walked over, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He took the cup, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second. It wasn't intentional, or maybe it was, but the warmth of his skin sent a shiver up my spine. I pulled my hand back quickly, tucking it awkwardly into my pocket. "You've been working late," I said, my voice steadier this time. "Sometimes the best ideas come at night," he replied, his gaze lingering on me just a moment longer than necessary. "Though I think I'm hitting a wall." "What's the story about?" I asked, genuinely curious. He took a sip of the tea, his eyes studying me over the rim of the cup. "It's about people trying to navigate relationships. The messy kind, the ones that don't fit into neat categories." I hesitated. There was something in his tone, a subtle weight to his words, that made me feel like this conversation wasn't just about his project. "Messy relationships?" He set the cup down and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "The kind where lines blur, where people want something they can't, or shouldn't, have." The air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. I should have said something, anything to cut through it. Instead, I nodded and turned toward the door. "Well, good luck with it. Let me know if you need any more tea." The next few days passed in a strange haze. I found reasons to linger in the living room when Alex was there, asking him about his script, offering suggestions, or pretending to straighten the cushions on the couch while he worked. He wasn't oblivious to it. I could tell by the slight smirk that played on his lips whenever I hovered nearby. "You seem invested in this project," he teased one afternoon as I handed him a notebook he'd left on the coffee table. "It's interesting," I replied, brushing off his comment with a forced laugh. "I like hearing about how stories come together." "You like hearing about messy relationships," he corrected, his tone playful but his eyes serious. I froze for half a second before forcing another laugh. "Maybe." It was late one evening when I stepped outside for some air. The summer night was warm, the soft hum of crickets filling the silence. I stood on the back patio, my arms crossed, staring up at the moon. My thoughts felt tangled, like a web I couldn't untangle. The sound of the screen door opening behind me pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Alex stepping out, his silhouette sharp against the dim light from the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost intimate in the quiet. I shook my head. "Just needed some fresh air." He moved closer, standing beside me. The scent of cedarwood and coffee followed him, grounding and unsettling all at once. We stood in silence for a moment, the kind that felt more like a conversation than the words we hadn't said. "It's beautiful out here," he murmured, his voice so close I could feel the warmth of it on my skin. I nodded, my throat dry. "It is." I don't know how it happened. One moment we were standing apart, and the next his hand was brushing against mine. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My breath caught as he turned toward me, his eyes searching mine for permission, or maybe for the same hesitation I felt. "Emma," he said, my name a whisper, almost a question. I didn't answer. I couldn't have if I'd tried. His hand slid up to my wrist, his touch gentle but firm. Before I could think, his lips were on mine, soft, tentative at first, then urgent. I felt the world tilt beneath me, everything else falling away. When we broke apart, I took a shaky step back, my heart racing. "I can't," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. I turned and hurried inside, not daring to look back. But even as I climbed into bed next to Jake, my mind was already back on the patio, on the way Alex had looked at me, on the way his touch had burned. Jake's arms tightened around me, his breath steady against my neck. The familiar rhythm of his chest, rising and falling, should have been comforting, grounding. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, feeling every fiber of my body tense with thoughts I couldn't control. "I love you," he whispered, his voice warm and sincere. "I love you too," I replied automatically, though my mind was far away. I wasn't here, in this bed, in this life. I was somewhere else entirely, with someone else. I was with him, but I was thinking of another. Over the next few days, my moments with Alex became like stolen pages from a secret diary. Small, fleeting, but infinitely precious. A shared glance over breakfast, a whispered conversation in the hallway, the brush of his hand against mine as we passed each other in the kitchen. None of it felt deliberate, yet none of it felt accidental either. It was late one afternoon when Alex caught me as I was tidying up the living room. Jake had gone out to meet a client, leaving the house quiet. Alex sat on the edge of the couch, his notebook open on his lap. "You seem distracted," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Just a lot on my mind," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, setting the notebook aside. I hesitated, the words bubbling just beneath the surface. "It's nothing," I said finally. "Just, you know how life gets." "I do," he said, leaning forward slightly. "But sometimes it helps to talk." There was a sincerity in his voice that disarmed me, made me want to spill everything. But instead, I shook my head, offering a small smile. "Thanks, but I'll be fine." He didn't press further, but the way he looked at me lingered, his gaze soft but probing. The next time we were alone, he suggested something unexpected. "You've been tense lately," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter as I rinsed out a coffee cup. "You should take a break." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "A break from what? Life?" "Exactly," he said, his smile playful. "Come with me tomorrow. There's a spa I've been meaning to check out. You'll love it." "A spa?" I repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Is that what writers do for inspiration these days?" He chuckled, shrugging. "Sometimes even writers need to unwind." It was absurd, and yet I found myself agreeing. The spa was everything he promised, warm, quiet, and intimate. Soft music played in the background, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. We sat in a private lounge, each with a cup of herbal tea. The world outside felt a million miles away. "This place is amazing," I said, letting the warmth of the tea seep into my hands. "Sometimes you need to escape," he replied, his voice low, "even if it's just for a little while." His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I hesitated before speaking, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel invisible?" He set his cup down, his gaze locking onto mine. "What do you mean?" "In my life," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I feel like everything is in its place. Everything is fine. But sometimes, I feel like I'm just part of the background." "You're not invisible," he said firmly. "Not to me." The intensity of his words stole my breath. I looked away, my cheeks warming under his gaze. As we were leaving, he stopped me just outside the door. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the parking lot. "Wait," he said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a simple silver bracelet, delicate but elegant. "What's this?" I asked, startled. "It reminded me of you," he said, his voice softer now. "Beautiful, strong, something you can't help but notice." My breath caught as he fastened it around my wrist. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a shiver through me. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alex!" He smiled, stepping back just enough to break the moment, but not the connection between us. Think of it as a reminder, he said, of how remarkable you are. As I drove home that evening, the bracelet glinting on my wrist, I couldn't stop the swirl of emotions within me. Gratitude, guilt, desire. It wasn't just a bracelet. It was a symbol, a line I wasn't sure I could keep from crossing. The mirror in Alex's rental house was small, framed with worn wood that spoke of years of salt and wind from the nearby shore. I stood before it, the late afternoon light filtering through the thin curtains, casting faint shadows on my face. My hands trembled as I slid my wedding ring off my finger. It was a simple act, but the weight of it crushed me. For a moment, I hesitated, staring at the empty space on my hand. What am I doing? The reflection offered no answers, only the reflection of a woman I barely recognized anymore. It had started innocently enough, or so I told myself. Come with me, Alex had said a few days earlier, his voice calm but insistent. I need your input on a scene I'm working on. I rented a place by the coast. It's quiet, perfect for focusing. I don't know, I replied, my voice hesitant. It's just a few hours, he added, leaning casually against the counter. No pressure, of course, but your perspective really helps. I knew I should have declined, but the way his eyes held mine, the way he made me feel seen, it was intoxicating. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The drive to the house was quiet. My mind raced with 1,000 reasons to turn back, but none of them could overpower the pull I felt toward him. The house was modest, tucked away behind a row of dunes. The sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air, a constant rhythmic backdrop. Alex opened the door, gesturing for me to enter. Welcome to my little escape, he said with a small smile. Inside, the space was sparsely furnished, but cozy. A wooden table was littered with papers and a laptop, and a small couch faced a window that framed the ocean like a painting. I've been stuck on this scene, he explained, motioning to the mess on the table. I could use your help unraveling it. What's it about? I asked, sitting down across from him. He hesitated, his hands running through his hair. It's about two people who find each other at the wrong time. They're drawn together, but life, it doesn't make things easy for them. His words hit like a punch to the chest. I looked at him, and for a moment, I wondered if he was speaking about us. What happens to them? I asked softly. He met my gaze, his expression serious. I haven't decided yet. The air between us grew heavy, the unspoken truth hanging like a storm cloud. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we found ourselves sitting on the couch. The papers and script had been forgotten, replaced by a silence filled with tension. Emma, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to him, my heart pounding. I can't do this anymore, he continued, his words tumbling out like a confession. Pretending I don't feel this way. Pretending I don't think about you every second of the day. Alex, I started, but he shook his head. Just let me say it, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I can't forget the way you look at me, the way you make me feel. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to tell him to stop, to leave this unspoken, but I couldn't. He moved closer, his hand brushing against mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. Slowly, tentatively, his lips found mine. The kiss was soft at first, like a question, but it quickly deepened. It was everything I'd been holding back, everything I'd been denying. The sharp trill of my phone shattered the moment. I pulled away, fumbling to grab it from my bag. Jake's name flashed on the screen, and my heart nearly stopped. I answered, my voice trembling. Hi! Hey, he said, his tone cheerful and unsuspecting. I was just checking in. Where are you? I'm at the store, I lied, my voice cracking slightly. Picking up a few things. Everything okay? He asked, his concern genuine. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a laugh. Everything's fine. I'll be home soon. When I hung up, I couldn't bring myself to look at Alex. The weight of what we'd done, and what I'd become, pressed down on me. I should go, I whispered, standing up. But even as I walked to the door, I knew this wasn't the end. The house was quiet as I cleaned up the coffee table, tucking away stray papers and smoothing out the cushions. Jake had stepped out to the store, and I relished the brief solitude. But as I reached for the bracelet lying on the edge of the table, I froze. I hadn't even realized I'd taken it off. Before I could grab it, Jake's voice startled me. What's this? I turned to see him standing in the doorway, holding the bracelet between his fingers. His expression wasn't suspicious, just curious. It's lovely, he said, holding it up to the light. Where did you get it? My mouth went dry. Oh, it's just something I picked up at the shop, I lied, my voice too quick, too rehearsed. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and placed it back on the table. But I couldn't shake the way his eyes lingered on me for just a second too long. That evening, as Jake sat at his desk working, I found myself watching him. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands deftly sketching lines on paper. He looked so steady, so sure of himself, of us. But I knew better. I knew the gulf that had grown between us, the way his touch no longer lit up my skin, the way his words, no matter how kind, felt hollow. He loved me, of that I had no doubt. But his love had become routine, a quiet, dependable thing that neither challenged nor fulfilled me. And yet, the thought of losing him filled me with a fear so deep it was almost paralyzing. Alex, on the other hand, was relentless. I can't keep doing this, he said one afternoon when we were alone in the living room. Jake was out for a meeting, and Alex had seized the opportunity to corner me. What do you mean? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. This, he said, gesturing between us. The stolen moments, the secrets. I want more, Emma. I want us to be together. For real. You don't know what you're asking, I said, my voice shaking. I know exactly what I'm asking, he shot back, his tone firm. I'm asking you to choose, to stop pretending you're happy in a life that's suffocating you. His words cut deep because they were true, but they were also terrifying. What about Jake? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His jaw tightened. I don't want to hurt him, but I can't keep lying to myself, and I don't think you can either. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The breaking point came the following evening. We were sitting in the dining room, Jake, Alex, and I, sharing a quiet dinner. The conversation was light, with Jake discussing a new project he was excited about. I tried to engage, to act normal, but my mind was elsewhere. You know, I said absent-mindedly, that little house by the coast was so charming. The words were out before I realized my mistake. Jake looked up, confused. What house? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Oh, I stammered. I mean, Alex mentioned he'd been staying at a rental near the coast. It sounded nice. Jake's eyes flicked to Alex, who quickly looked down at his plate. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Didn't realize you two had time to chat about that, Jake said, his tone casual but his expression sharp. The rest of the meal passed in a strained silence. That night, as Jake brushed his teeth in the bathroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. The bracelet on my wrist felt heavier than ever, a silent witness to my betrayal. When Jake finally came to bed, he kissed me on the forehead and turned out the light. But as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew. The muffled sound of Jake's voice filtered through the wooden door of his office as I passed by. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the raw edge in his tone made me pause. You think I don't know? He said, his voice low but seething with restrained anger. "I've seen them. I just. I can't believe it." My stomach dropped. I pressed my hand against the wall, bracing myself against the tidal wave of guilt that washed over me. He knew. Of course he knew. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the bracelet around my wrist as Jake emerged from his office. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but his eyes were what struck me most. They were clouded with hurt, anger, and something that looked almost like defeat. "Emma," he said, his voice heavy. I stood, my legs trembling. "Jake, I—" "Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me by pretending nothing's happened." His words hit like a slap. I opened my mouth to speak, but he didn't let me. "How long?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. Tears stung my eyes. "Jake, it's not what you think." "Don't lie to me, Emma," he said sharply. "Just don't." The silence between us stretched, unbearable and suffocating. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I didn't plan any of this." "But it happened," he said, his tone softer now, almost resigned. "You let it happen." I nodded, unable to deny it. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Destroying what we had?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know what I want anymore." Later, as the evening wore on, the house felt like a battlefield in the aftermath of a war. Jake retreated to his office, and I found Alex in the kitchen, peeling a ripe peach with meticulous precision. His hands moved slowly, the blade of the knife gliding over the soft skin. He didn't look up when I entered. "I think he knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex placed the knife down and turned to me, his expression calm but serious. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, the tears welling up again. "Emma," he said, stepping closer, "you can't keep living like this. You have to choose." His words were gentle, but they carried the weight of an ultimatum. Jake confronted me again later that night. This time, his anger had burned out, leaving only exhaustion in its place. "I tried," he said, his voice hoarse. "I tried to give you everything you needed, but I guess it wasn't enough." "It's not your fault," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You've been everything a husband should be. I lost myself somewhere along the way." "And you found yourself with him?" Jake asked, his voice breaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next morning, Alex packed his bags. He didn't say much, but the unspoken understanding between us was clear. He placed his suitcase in the trunk of his car, his movements deliberate, as if trying to prolong the moment. When he turned to face me, his expression was unreadable. "You'll be okay," he said softly. I nodded, though I didn't believe it. As he got into the car and started the engine, I stood on the porch, watching. He paused for a moment, his gaze meeting mine through the window. And then he drove away. Jake stood in the doorway behind me, his presence a heavy weight on my shoulders. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. As the car disappeared down the road, I felt the tears spill over, hot and unrelenting. The bracelet on my wrist glinted in the sunlight, a silent reminder of everything I had gained and lost. The house was still, too still, and I was left standing on the porch, caught between the wreckage of my past and the uncertainty of my future. The days after Alex left were quiet, like the aftermath of a storm. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, pressing into every corner of the house. Jake and I moved around each other carefully, like strangers trying not to collide in a narrow hallway. I spent most of my time avoiding mirrors. I couldn't stand the reflection staring back at me, the hollow eyes, the trembling hands. The bracelet had been tucked away in a drawer, but sometimes, in the stillness of the evening, I'd take it out, turning it over in my hands, feeling its weight. Jake and I tried to talk once. It was a Saturday evening, and the sun was setting, bathing the living room in a soft golden glow. He sat on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Do you want to fix this?" he asked finally, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "I don't know," I replied honestly. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. "Do you?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the pain etched into every line of his face. "I don't know either." The silence that followed was deafening. One afternoon, I found myself driving aimlessly, the car winding through streets that felt both familiar and foreign. Somehow, I ended up by the coast, near the house Alex had rented. It looked the same, small, weathered, with the ocean stretching endlessly behind it. I parked the car and stepped out, the salty air filling my lungs. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the waves crashing against the shore. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to cry. Not the quiet tears I had shed in the privacy of my bedroom, but deep, guttural sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for Jake, for Alex, for myself, for everything I had lost and everything I still didn't know how to find. When I returned home that evening, Jake was in his office. The door was ajar, and I could see him sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. For a moment, I thought about walking in, about saying something, anything. But the words caught in my throat, and I turned away. Weeks turned into months, and life carried on in its quiet, unsteady way. Jake and I shared meals, talked about the weather, the news, the mundane details of our lives. But there was a chasm between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. I thought about Alex sometimes, about his smile, his touch, the way he had looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. But the memories felt distant now, like a dream I wasn't sure I had actually lived. One evening, as I was cleaning out my closet, I came across the bracelet again. I held it in my hand, feeling its smooth surface, its cool weight. Without thinking, I walked outside to the backyard. The air was crisp, and the sky was painted with stars. I stood there for a long time, the bracelet clutched tightly in my fist. And then, with a deep breath, I let it go. It fell into the grass, glinting faintly in the moonlight. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. When I walked back inside, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Emma," he said softly. I stopped, my hand resting on the back of the chair. "Do you think we can ever be okay again?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat down across from him, meeting his gaze. "I don't know," I said finally, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between us felt just a little bit lighter.